Good morning. This is Crystal Woods with Seasons in the Vine, and it's Fresh Friday. And today I want to talk to you about types of food. Uh, this has been a Fresh Friday thought for a good bit now, and I have a couple of notes. And this is just going to be a general biblical principle, Christian living Fresh Friday. I'll be popping all over the Bible in many different places to bring the message together. But I want to talk about food. There is food in Egypt. So let's think about the Israelites, the nation of Israel in bondage in Egypt. And one of the things that was really hard for them in the wilderness wandering was the food source was different. It required a different level of trust, and it scared them. It freaked them out. So in Egypt, they had food they could count on. It was the same. It was going to be there. They had work. They had shelter. And that's something that bondage can do in a sly kind of way. It creates in us a complacency where the bread of bondage can cause sleepiness and compliance. They wanted to go back to Egypt because they at least would have the food that required no trust. Trust is hard. Having faith that God is going to come through and provide is challenging. And so in those wanderings, we really see them struggling. And God does provide for them. He provides food in the wilderness. And this food that we eat of is different, but it requires faith and trust. The food of bondage is reliable. We can go back to it. It's consistent. This is what it is. But it brings about complacency and sleepiness and compliance to the ways of bondage. But the food in the wilderness is different because the source is different and it's coming from God. And so what we see in the wilderness wandering is a dependency on God for what they needed. And that is where it was scary because they didn't know how faithful he was going to be. To them, Egypt was more faithful, but Egypt's faithfulness came at a very high cost. And God was calling them into freedom. But that freedom meant they were going to have to trust God and not the comfort of their bondage and slavery. Do you kind of see a parallel? When God is calling us out of sin and out of bondage and out of things that are not of him, we wonder, well, what's it going to be like if I don't have this in my life, this addiction, this sin, this way of doing things, the way that I do things? What's going to happen if I go that direction? Will God come through? What will my life look like? And those questions are valid. And a lot of times, though, when we don't get the answers we want from those questions because they actually require just getting out there and going in faith, we stay in bondage. We choose, like the Israelites, to go back to Egypt. They wanted to go back. Thank goodness they had Moses there that was like, no. And the Lord was working with Moses and the people stayed in the wilderness wandering. But we may decide, I'm going to stay with what I know, even though what I know is not good for me. And that's the complacency and sleepiness of the food of bondage. Now, the food in the wilderness, it brings about a calm as we step into that because we begin to see God as my provider. He's going to give me what I need every day. He's not going to give me enough to store up so that I don't remain dependent. Not at this stage, not in this phase. This phase is quail and manna. This is, I can't collect too much manna or it'll rot. So it's just enough for today so that dependence comes. That faithfulness of God is something that the Israelites and we begin to take on as we step into the wilderness. Don't shortcut your wilderness by running back to comfort, running back to old sin, running back to the bondage. Because when we get uncomfortable in the wilderness, we have two options. We can stay in the wilderness, which is what I'm petitioning you to do. Let it do its work. Let the dependence on God come. It's super uncomfortable. We don't like it, but God is there providing for us what we actually need in that moment so that we see him as Father. If we don't do that, though, we'll run back to feeding our flesh. I've heard people say retail therapy. That's a fancy word of just saying shopping addiction. And I heard that phrase, oh my gosh, probably at least 15 to 16 years ago. It was a long time ago. And I remember thinking like, oh, that's a coping mechanism. That's a coping strategy, but it's bondage. For others, it might be alcohol. It might be sex. It might be looking for attention in all the wrong places. It might be food. It could be anything. It could be exercise. We can find ourselves going back into bondage when we begin to get uncomfortable with trusting God and just knowing that even though I'm out here in the wilderness and I don't like all that I'm feeling right now, as God is stripping away the bondage and the things that I have been entertaining for what he has, I'm going to stick with it. So stay in the wilderness. What happens in the wilderness is important. It's forming you. And it's forming your relationship with God. How you navigate the wilderness is going to reveal and prepare you for how you will navigate the promised land. Because if we don't do the wilderness well, we actually can't handle the promised land. We can't walk in that much freedom. We can't restrain ourselves. We can't go out and work for food now and still completely rely on God. We'll forget about him. We'll fall into self-reliance. And then guess what? We end up back in the wilderness. We have to learn it again. So the food in the wilderness brings a dependence on God. No one and nothing else can be your provider. Food that brings confidence. It's the things that bring confidence in God, but it's also the food that's going to bring that complete freedom from the bondage. So don't shortcut it. Now, food in the promised land is very different. They're no longer receiving manna or quail. They are going into a land where they're going to be able to be shepherds. They're going to have grazing land for animals. They're going to have milk. That's where the milk idea comes from. The milk is not coming out of nowhere. It means they have animals that are providing milk. They're going to have land, pasture land, to have livestock. The other thing is honey. So there's valuable, sweet, precious things in the way of food. And that provision in the promised land, it's sweet and it's great, but the bees are working towards that. And there's some risk in getting the honey. There is some trusting of God to even get honey. Grapes, so there's ability to grow in the promised land, to grow your own food. So now we're toiling and we're working and we're being gardeners and we're being shepherds. And so it's not just coming from God because we've learned to be dependent, and now he is going to give us a measure of independence, which is called maturity. Maturity is having everything available to you, but choosing to depend on God. I'm going to work because we're built to work, and I'm going to go into this promised land. I'm going to partake of this food. I'm going to work in freedom and complete dependence on God, because I know what I learned in the wilderness. People will do well in the promised land when they don't forget their utter dependence on God, even though now they're participating in their provision. Are you tracking with me? So this is like deep thoughts about food. But the trust in the promised land has to be remembered. And what we saw in the history of the Israelite nation, of the nation of Israel, what we saw in that people group is that they did forget God. They forgot him. They fell back into bondage. They had to be brought back out, and in these cycles over and over and over again, because they just didn't have the maturity to handle the promised land. They didn't stay dependent on God. They forgot about God. They began to worship other gods. They began to make their confidence in what they could produce themselves. You know why the Sabbath day was so important? Well, all the pagan nations worked 7 days a week. Farmers would maybe feel the urge even to work 7 days a week, but that's trusting you. That's trusting your way of working for yourself and not trusting God. So when God told the people to set a day aside as holy and to not work, what he was saying is, I'm your provider. Trust me to take a break, to take a rest like he did, and know that I will provide for you in that gap. The pagan nations, they don't have a father who provides for them, so they have to do it for themselves. But they would forget that. That's one of the things that happens in Nehemiah. They're working on the Sabbath. They're having a market day on the Sabbath. And this is a direct issue with God because they are living as the world instead of people that belong to God and can trust him for it. So we have to grow up. And in growing up, we enter the promised land and we do work and we do bring what we bring to the table, but it's from a place of knowing God is still our provider and that we have to have full dependency on him. Now, one final thing I'll leave you with. Jesus in the Gospels says that he is eating a different kind of food. It's a food that the disciples don't know anything about. They are worried about Jesus eating, and they're so concerned in this situation. And he's like, don't worry about my food. I'm eating a different kind of food. I'm eating a spiritual food. And what that food was, it was beyond physical, because Jesus is so elite in this. It was beyond that. It was the food of his Father's will. So he was eating what his Father had for him to do. And that was his sustenance. That's how he was sustained. And so there's these levels of understanding food. It gets beyond even our everyday provision of housing and food literally and things like that, to the place where I'm eating of what God has put on my life. I'm eating what God wants me to do today. That's the primary food source. I am walking in what God has for me today, and I'm doing it in the way that he's told me to do it. And that's the kind of food that Jesus felt was even more primary than regular physical food. So I'm just going to throw that your way. I'm not going to say I have any solutions or questions even. I think the only question to ask is, what is the food that you're eating today? Where are you at? Are you in bondage and eating the bread of affliction and bondage? Are you in the wilderness and eating manna from heaven and in a completely limited state of maturity because you are not able to go out on your own yet? Are you in the promised land where you are mature enough to walk away and do and always remember to come back? And have you gotten to the place where the greatest food you can eat every day is not a physical thing, but a spiritual one, where the goal of your life is to live for God and to do things like Jesus? Hope you have a good week.